Hey everyone, welcome back to today, your daily deep dive into, well, everything you need to know. You can find us every day right here on our YouTube channel, News and Views. I'm Derek, and this is Samantha, and we are diving into some pretty choppy waters today. Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE. It's really shaken things up in Washington, and frankly, it's got a lot of folks worried. Just in the past few weeks, DOGE has been making waves, pushing for mass buyouts and potential layoffs of federal employees. Like, can you imagine 65,000 people losing their jobs?
Wow.
They've also gotten their hands on some really sensitive government data, like the systems that control how the Treasury pays out money. That's some scary stuff.
Yeah, that's a little unnerving.
And then on top of all that, they're freezing funding for important programs. Even things like the EPA's Solar for All initiative. It's like, what is going on here?
It's kind of wild how much power DOGE seems to have. Like, they went from 0 to 60 in just a few weeks, burrowing into all these different government departments, making these massive changes, and there's not a lot of pushback.
Yeah, and Musk keeps saying it's all about, fighting waste and fraud, protecting taxpayer dollars. I mean, he even said on X, quote, obviously DOGE is trying to stop your tax dollars from being stolen for waste and fraud. But some of the things they're doing, like canceling subscriptions to publications like Politico, it feels more like an attempt to control information than to save money.
Right, it really makes you wonder, what's the real goal here? Is it about efficiency, or is there, like, a bigger power play happening? And that access to the Treasury system, that's a huge red flag. If DOGE can control how money flows in and out of the government, I mean, that gives them a level of control that's pretty unsettling.
It's almost like Musk is creating his own little empire within the government, with him at the top calling all the shots.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And the problem is, he wasn't elected. He was appointed by the president. But he's acting more and more like a shadow president, making these decisions that impact all of us. But there's no real accountability.
So let's try to unpack this a little bit. We've got these buyouts happening, which, could lead to a massive reduction in the federal workforce. We've got DOGE digging into these sensitive financial systems.
Yeah.
And we've got funding for these really important programs getting cut off.
Yeah, and it's all happening with very little transparency. We don't know who's really making the decisions at DOGE, what their qualifications are, or what their long-term plans are. It's a lot of power concentrated in the hands of a very small group of people. And that's always a recipe for trouble.
Okay, so let's start with these buyouts. Over 65,000 federal workers have already taken the deal. But, what does that actually mean? What are these people signing up for? And what happens to those who decide not to take the buyout?
Well, a buyout is basically an offer to leave your job, voluntarily, of course, in exchange for, some kind of financial incentive. It might be a lump sum payment or maybe extended benefits, things like that. It's just a way to, shrink the government workforce without actually firing people.
So it sounds like a pretty sweet deal, right? Why wouldn't everyone just take the money and run?
Well, it's not quite that simple. First of all, a lot of these federal employees, they're dedicated public servants. They believe in the work they do, and they want to continue serving the country. It's not just about the paycheck for them,
Right, yeah, that makes sense. And I guess there's also the question of, what happens next? Even with a buyout, finding a new job isn't always easy, especially if you've been in government for a long time.
Exactly. And there's another layer to this, too. Remember how we talked about DOGE trying to control information? Well, the buyouts seem to be playing into that as well. They're targeting agencies and departments that have been critical of Musk and DOGE, places like the EPA and USA.
So it's like a way to silence dissent within the government, get rid of the people who might speak out against what DOGEs are doing.
It's certainly a possibility, and it creates this, chilling effect for the people who stay. If you see your colleagues getting pushed out for speaking their minds, you're going to be less likely to, rock the boat yourself.
Yeah, that makes sense. So what about the folks who don't take the buyout? What happens to them?
Well, the implication is that they could be laid off. We're hearing that DOGE is looking to cut tens of thousands of jobs, and the buyouts are just the first step. So those who refuse the offer, they could find themselves out of a job, and without that financial cushion of a buyout.
It's almost like they're being given a choice between a rock and a hard place. Take the money and leave quietly, or risk losing your job altogether.
Yeah, it's a tough spot to be in, for sure. It creates this climate of fear and uncertainty within the government. People are afraid to speak up, afraid to do anything that might put their jobs at risk.
It's interesting. I read that some federal employees, they're using the spoon emoji as a symbol of resistance against these buyouts.
Oh, yeah, that's right. It's a play on the administration's fork in the road memo about the buyout offer. It's pretty clever, actually, using the spoon emoji. It's a subtle way for employees to signal that they're not buying into DOGE's agenda.
Yeah, it's a pretty clever way to protest,
Yeah,
especially in a work environment where you might not be able to, speak out directly.
exactly. It's a way to show solidarity, to let each other know that they're not alone and feeling uneasy about what's happening.
Okay, so we've got this whole buyout situation, creating all this tension and anxiety among federal workers. But let's talk about the other big issue here, the funding freezes. DOGE is cutting off money for all sorts of programs, everything from USAID to the EPA's Solar for All initiative. So, what's the impact of that?
The impact is huge, and it's being felt all over the place. Take USAID, for example. They provide humanitarian assistance around the world, helping people in need, promoting democracy, and supporting economic development. Cutting their funding, I mean, that could have devastating consequences for some of the most vulnerable populations on the planet.
Wow. And what about programs here at home? What's happening with things like the Solar for All initiative?
Well, that program was designed to, make solar energy more affordable
Yeah.
and accessible for low-income communities. It was helping to fight climate change, create jobs, and reduce energy costs. But with the funding freeze, it's all come to a screeching halt.
Man, that's a real shame. It sounds like a program that was doing a lot of good, and now it's just, hanging in limbo.
Yeah. And it's not just solar for all either. DOGE has frozen funding for rural development grants, which, help support small businesses and infrastructure projects in rural areas. These grants, they're vital for creating jobs and boosting local economies in communities that are already struggling.
It's like DOGE's taking a sledgehammer to the government,
Yeah.
smashing everything in sight. And there's just no regard for the consequences. And the worst part is, it's all happening without any real transparency or accountability. We don't know how these decisions are being made, who's being consulted, or what the long-term plan is.
It's a recipe for disaster. You can't
Yeah.
just slash funding for vital programs and expect everything to be fine. I mean, there are real people's lives at stake here, both here in the U.S. and around the world.
Yeah, it's really concerning. And it all goes back to this question of power, right? DOGE has amassed an incredible amount of power in a very short period of time. And they're using it in ways that are alarming a lot of people. They're bypassing Congress, ignoring traditional procedures, making these unilateral decisions that impact all of us.
Yeah, it's like a power grab, and it's happening right before our eyes. The question is, what can be done about it? Are there any checks and balances left that can, rein in DOGE and prevent them from causing even more damage?
Yeah, it feels like we've stumbled into some kind of political thriller. We've got this rogue agency operating in the shadows of a powerful billionaire pulling the strings and a whole lot of people caught in the crossfire. So are there any ways to, fight back? What can be done to stop this?
Well, it's not a hopeless situation. There are a few things that could potentially put the brakes on, DOGE's power trip. For one thing, there are already multiple lawsuits challenging DOGE's authority and the legality of their actions.
So the courts could step in and say, hold on, you can't just do whatever you want.
Exactly. Some legal experts argue that DOGE is overstepping its bounds, that they're violating the Constitution, and that Congress needs to reassert its authority. So if the courts agree, that could significantly limit DOGE's power.
That would be a major win for the folks who are worried about DOGE's unchecked power. What else can be done?
Well, public pressure can also play a role. The more people understand what's happening with the DOGE, the more they're likely to, demand accountability from their elected officials. There are already protests happening, advocacy groups are mobilizing, and even some members of Congress are starting to speak out against DOGE's actions.
So it's like a David and Goliath situation. Ordinary citizens and grassroots organizations banding together to fight back against this, powerful force.
Yeah, it kind of has that feeling, doesn't it? And remember those spoon emojis we talked about? That's a small example of how people are finding these creative ways to resist. It's a way to show solidarity, to raise awareness, and to signal that they're not going down without a fight.
It's pretty inspiring to see people standing up for what they believe in, even when the odds seem, stacked against them.
Yeah.
But let's go back to those buyouts for a minute. We talked about how they're putting federal employees in this, really tough spot. But you mentioned that there might be some legal issues with the buyouts themselves.
Oh, that's right. So the initial offer, it seemed pretty straightforward, right? Take the money and you're guaranteed your pay and benefits through September, even if you don't work.
Yeah, sounds like a pretty sweet deal, at least on the surface.
Yeah, but then some employees started receiving draft contracts with different terms. Some of these contracts require employees to work through February and then put them on paid administrative leave starting in March. But here's the catch. The contract language suggests that the pay guarantee, it hinges on Congress approving a new budget by mid-March.
Hold on, so they're basically asking employees to gamble
Yeah.
on whether Congress will come through with the money.
Yeah. It's a pretty risky proposition, especially in the current political climate. Congress has been, notoriously slow and gridlocked when it comes to budget negotiations, and there's no guarantee they'll meet that deadline.
So these employees could end up losing their jobs on their promised buyout money if Congress doesn't act in time. I mean, that's just cruel.
It's a mess, and it really highlights the lack of transparency and accountability surrounding DOGE's actions. They're making these big promises, but they're not necessarily following through, and they're putting people's livelihoods at risk in the process.
It's easy to get lost in the weeds with all the legal details and the political maneuvering, but at the end of the day, this is about real people's lives. We're talking about thousands of federal employees who are facing an uncertain future, families who are worried about paying their bills, communities that rely on the services provided by these agencies.
That's exactly right. We can't lose sight of the human cost of DOGE's actions. Behind all the talk about efficiency and cost cutting, there are real people who are being impacted, and the consequences could be, they could be devastating.
So what does this all mean? What's the takeaway from all of this?
I think the biggest takeaway is that we're at a crossroads. DOGE represents a new kind of power dynamic in our government, one that's concentrated in the hands of a single individual with, minimal oversight. And we're seeing the potential dangers of that kind of power play out in real time. It's a wake-up call for all of us.
So it's not just about Elon Musk or DOGE, right? It's about the future of our government, the future of our democracy, and the future of our country.
That's a great way to put it. We need to be vigilant, demand accountability from our leaders, and engage in these crucial conversations about the kind of society we want to live in.
Well, Samantha, I have to say, this has been one of the most intense deep dives we've ever done. It's clear that Elon Musk and DOGE they're changing the game in Washington, and it's not entirely clear what the final score will be. But one thing's for sure, we all need to be paying attention and making our voices heard.
Absolutely. The future's still being written, and we all have a role to play in shaping it.
Well, thanks for joining us today for another deep dive here on Today on our YouTube channel, News and Views. I'm Derek, and this is Samantha, and we'll be back tomorrow with another deep dive into a fascinating topic that's shaping our world. Until then, stay curious and stay engaged.